January 16, 1942. Midnight. North Sea, 75 miles off the Dutch coast. Waves slammed against the steel hull of the submarine as wind tore sideways across the frozen water. Inside the British vessel HMS Seadigger, 29 men sat in silence, the diesel engines replaced by the hum of electric motors. Silent running. No talking. No lights. Every man soaked in sweat and tension. For 3 days they had been submerged, evading German patrol boats that swept these waters after the fall of France. And now they had reached the edge of the impossible. In the torpedo room, Major Alistair Greaves adjusted the rubber seals on his dry suit. He had trained for this moment in wind tunnels, in flooded chambers, in blacked-out kill houses built under Scottish castles. But even now, even here, with his heart pounding against his ribs, he couldn't hear anything except the ticking of his own watch. 4 men stood with him, no names, only code names: Wren, Anchor, Mason, Palliser. They weren't soldiers, not in the traditional sense. They were what MI6 had built in secret after the fall of Norway, men trained to move like shadows and disappear like ghosts. And tonight they would step into the jaws of the German war machine, not to fight, but to steal. Greaves raised one hand, fingers steady despite the cold. "Flood forward chamber," he whispered. Within minutes the outer hatch opened, the sea roared in, and the 5 men vanished into the darkness. The mission had no name in official records. It would never be mentioned in the war diaries, never be listed among campaigns or medals. But in a locked cabinet deep within Bletchley Park, it would become known by a single code name: Operation Wintertide. Its target was a listening post hidden within occupied Holland, a relay station for encrypted Kriegsmarine signals feeding directly into U-boat Wolfpack coordination. London had intercepted the transmissions for weeks. They came in bursts, encrypted, sharp, tight windows. MI6 believed the codes weren't just routine, they were being used to coordinate mass ambushes against Allied convoys in the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy was bleeding. December alone had seen 26 merchant ships sunk in a single week. Entire convoys disappeared. Civilians drowned in the cold. The Prime Minister had been blunt. "If we do not crack the German naval cipher, we will lose the Atlantic. And if we lose the Atlantic, we lose the war." What Bletchley Park needed wasn't another recording. They needed the device itself. 3 miles inland from the Dutch coast, just north of Den Helder, lay a squat concrete building tucked beneath a wind-blasted bluff. From the outside, it resembled a local weather station, the kind left behind by pre-war Dutch meteorological services. Inside, it was a different story. The structure was reinforced, camouflaged, and connected via buried cable to the heart of Berlin's Kriegsmarine Command. It housed a single German naval Enigma machine, a Type M4. 3 rotors, 1 reflector, 1 plugboard. And a 4th rotor, recently introduced, the reason no one at Bletchley could read anything anymore. Not without that rotor. Not without a settings list. Not without something physical. Greaves and his team had 48 hours to breach the compound, locate the device, copy its internal configuration, and exfiltrate without alerting the German garrison 10 miles down the coast. Failure didn't mean capture. Failure meant the Germans changed their cipher keys. And then the Atlantic would go dark. The first step was insertion. Greaves and his men emerged from the surf like sea creatures, black shapes slipping through dunes and grass. The wind howled. Rain began to fall sideways, driven by the same storm that had drowned 2 German trawlers the day before. Perfect. The compound sat behind a low wire fence, lightly guarded. 2 sentries with Mauser carbines, a searchlight sweeping the mud. Nothing that suggested high value. That in itself confirmed what London suspected. the Germans believed no one could reach it. Greaves moved with the rain. At 2:15, the first guard dropped without a sound. Palliser had used a piano wire, the movement practiced 1,000 times. At 2:20, the second went down. Wren took his rifle, slid the corpse under a pile of stacked coal. By 2:35, they were inside. What they found shook them. It wasn't just an Enigma machine. There were two. One of them still running, its light panels flickering in the gloom. A recent message sat half-decoded on the desk beside it. Greaves's eyes scanned the paper. His German was rough, but he recognized the word repeated 3 times. Convoy. 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 This wasn't a weather station. This was a forward control node. U-boat wolf packs were being directed from this room. The Atlantic battles weren't being commanded from Berlin. They were being choreographed from here. Wren moved fast, snapping photos of the plugboard configuration. Anchor opened the rotor casing and began mapping the internal wiring with a grease pencil on acetate. Every move was precise, practiced. But time was bleeding away. Greaves gave the silent countdown, 5 minutes to extraction, then 4, then 3. Mason moved toward a metal cabinet near the wall, tugging it open. Inside, he found it, the daily rotor setting sheets, printed on carbon paper, stamped with today's date and the next 6 days. He slipped them into a waterproof pouch, sealed it, nodded. That's when the radio cracked to life. A burst of static, then German words. Unregelmäßigkeit bei Station Nord, Prüfen Sie sofort. Irregularity at Station North. Investigate immediately. Greaves whispered, "They know." He turned to give the order, but before the words left his mouth, the building shook with the first burst of gunfire. Outside, headlights sliced through the mist, trucks, infantry, dogs barking, searchlights scanning. The rain wasn't cover anymore. It was chaos. Greaves led the team through the rear entrance, across the mud, diving into a drainage ditch that led toward the coastline. Bullets cracked overhead. A flare burst in the sky, turning night into blue daylight. Palliser went down first. No scream, just a sharp exhale and a collapse into the mud. They didn't stop. By 4:10, only 3 reached the extraction point. The Seedegger had surfaced beneath the cliffs, its conning tower barely visible. A rope ladder hung in the blackness. Greaves pushed Wren up first, then Anchor. He turned back once, just once, and looked at the coast. It wasn't over, but something had changed. The secret hadn't been destroying a machine. It had been stealing just enough to read Berlin's voice. By January 22nd, the first decrypted naval Enigma messages began pouring into Bletchley. Convoy routes, U-boat positions, fuel reports, orders for ambush. Within 2 weeks, Allied convoys began rerouting away from traps that had cost thousands of lives. U-boat wolf packs found themselves drifting in empty sea, their prey gone. The Germans didn't know how. They didn't even know they'd been breached. And for the rest of the war, the British never told them. Greaves didn't speak for nearly an hour after the Seedegger submerged. The inside of the sub was red-lit and silent except for the hum of its electric motors and the gentle creak of cold pressure on the hull. Wren and Anchor sat across from him, their dry suits soaked through, hands still trembling from adrenaline. Palliser hadn't made it. Mason was bleeding out slowly in the med bay from a stomach wound. No one had said a word since the hatch sealed. The pouch sat between Greaves' boots. Inside it were 11 photos, 3 rotor diagrams, and a folded sheet of carbon paper with 6 days' worth of encrypted cipher keys. The first major break Bletchley Park would see in over 6 months. They were 30 fathoms under the North Sea, but it already felt like the pressure was lifting. Greaves didn't need to be told this was only the beginning. He'd been inside enough missions to know success wasn't measured by survival. It was measured by what came next. If they had captured the wrong diagrams, or if the Germans discovered the breach, the entire mission would mean nothing. When the Seedegger surfaced 72 hours later near Scapa Flow, 3 men stepped ashore with black bags and darker eyes. A battered van with Royal Post markings picked them up in the rain. No driver's name. No questions. Just a sheet of paper on the seat with one sentence. You are to report to Station X immediately. Inside Hut 8, the atmosphere was electric. Alan Turing stood over the workbench as a technician carefully unrolled the photograph transparencies. Turing's coat was soaked from rain. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, but his eyes were bright behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "No damage to the images?" he asked, voice clipped, barely hiding his urgency. "Clear as crystal, sir," the technician replied. "Rotor configurations match the intercepts." Turing scanned the grease-pencil sketches of the new M4 rotor, his fingers hovering above the diagrams as if touching them might disrupt their contents. He muttered under his breath, scribbling equations, converting rotor positions into numerical sequences. The room fell into total silence. The only sound was the scrape of pencil on paper, the occasional cough, and the low murmur of the bomb machines spinning like mechanical oracles in the adjacent hut. Then, without warning, Turing stood upright. "Cue the bomb to rotate rotors 2 and 4 against the naval setting from January 10th, he barked. "Now." The technicians jumped into action. The massive code-breaking device began spinning with a rattling hum, dozens of wheels rotating at blinding speed, searching for patterns in chaos. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Then the machine stopped. A technician leaned forward. "We have a match, sir." German message from January 11th. Entire decrypted text reads, "Convoy HX-165 sighted, grid reference BC-77, intercept at 400. Turing blinked, then turned slowly toward the glass. They're not blind anymore. By the end of January, U-boat wolfpacks operating in the central Atlantic began to report strange phenomena. Convoys that had been scheduled to cross known intercept points were disappearing. German sonar picked up Allied ships on courses that didn't match their intel. Submarines that surfaced in expected hunting zones found nothing but empty ocean and silence. Within 2 weeks, the Kriegsmarine's Admiralty suspected internal leaks. Several radio technicians were interrogated. Cipher sheets were reissued. But it was already too late. The breach had happened in such a surgical fashion that Berlin had no clue how deep it went. And MI6 made sure it stayed that way. In a safe house in Kent, Greaves sat across from Rear Admiral Godfrey, Churchill's Director of Naval Intelligence. The room smelled faintly of cigarettes and sea salt. Godfrey didn't offer tea. He didn't speak at first. He simply lit a match, leaned forward, and burned the edges of the carbon sheet Greaves had recovered until it curled into ash. "You understand," he said, voice dry, "this can never be mentioned, not even under closed testimony. If your name appears in a single footnote, it will be removed." Greaves nodded. "Was it worth it?" he asked. Godfrey looked up, one brow raised. "We've saved 3 convoys in the past 10 days. That's 111 merchant ships, hundreds of lives, 430,000 tons of cargo bound for the war effort. You tell me." Greaves said nothing, but in his mind he saw the black surf on the Dutch shore, Palliser going down, Mason bleeding quietly in the corridor of the Seedegger. He saw their faces every time he blinked. No medals, no records. Only the memory of silence, and the sound of boots moving through mud toward a machine that should have been unreachable. The effects rippled outward faster than MI6 anticipated. In February alone, Allied losses in the Atlantic dropped by nearly 40%. By March, convoys were traveling with near impunity under new routing directives issued from a nondescript office in Whitehall, coded in a cipher known only to Bletchley Park. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz ordered the relocation of his naval command to a hardened bunker. His own staff began rotating ciphers daily. Orders were shortened. Communications became erratic. But the Allies were already inside the wire. Greaves had returned to field training by then, assigned to a shadow program known only as Ink Glass. It wasn't a formal branch, and it didn't exist on any charter. But it took officers like him, the ones who could breach places no one else could, and folded them into missions even MI6 refused to acknowledge. His next deployment would take him to the Black Forest. His target, a radio technician believed to be smuggling cipher pads to the WW2. But the legacy of Wintertide followed him. Every ship that crossed the Atlantic, every submarine that never found its prey, every decrypted message. It all came back to one stormy night off the Dutch coast, and 5 men who slipped through the surf into the maw of the enemy, not to destroy anything, but to steal a rhythm. And for the rest of the war, that rhythm echoed in silence, unheard by the Germans, but felt in every convoy that made it home. Bletchley Park smelled like rain and burnt vacuum tubes. Wren stood in the corridor outside Hut 6, his uniform collar soaked, hair dripping onto the wax tile floor. The motorcycle from Scotland had broken a chain outside Banbury, and he'd run the last 3 miles in boots not meant for sprinting. But he was here. Inside, the decrypts lay warm off the line. Each page was still curled at the edges, smelling of ink and friction and urgency. He scanned the latest. Naval Group West Atlantic directives, grid square A checks, U-boat movements synchronized over 4 days, but something was wrong. The Germans were changing timing. The codes hadn't changed, but the rhythm had. Turing entered behind him, unshaven, eyes bloodshot. "Show me." Wren handed the decrypt over without a word. Turing scanned, frowned, tapped the line with his pencil. "They're routing subs back toward the Azores. They've figured something out." Wren exhaled. "They know we're watching." "No," Turing muttered. "Worse, they suspect someone's missing." In Wilhelmshaven, Germany, Naval Captain Fritz Langner stared across a dim hallway where a desk had been upended. The missing technician was named Georg Rassmuller. 2 weeks ago, he had failed to report for duty at a radio outpost near Aachen. Normally, a single missing technician wouldn't register. Men deserted. Others drank themselves into dishonor and vanished. But Rassmuller had clearance, and Rassmuller had been under quiet surveillance, not by the Gestapo, but by the WW2. Langner had intercepted the flag from within his own command chain. There had been discrepancies, cipher pads altered, slight errors in rotor alignment protocols. It was subtle, almost innocent, but it wasn't nothing. A man like Rassmuller with too much access and too many questions was never innocent. Langner ordered his staff to search Rassmuller's quarters. Nothing overt, but behind a loose floorboard they found 2 strips of Allied chewing gum and a matchbook from a British cafe in Gibraltar. He knew then someone was coming for the inside. Greaves had been briefed just once before boarding the train south. The carriage was empty except for the colonel who handed him the dossier and one thin envelope. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Rassmuller, age 32, glasses, weak chin but bright eyes. Mathematics instructor before the war. Drafted to naval signals. Unmarried. No known political ties. The last known contact. A coded message sent via disguised radio in the Black Forest. Unconfirmed if transmission reached Allied hands. Greaves flipped the photo twice and looked out the window. The snow outside blurred the horizon. It reminded him of the surf off Den Helder, the last seconds before they'd opened the hatch into the sea. He hadn't forgotten the sound of Palliser falling 1 foot from the ditch line. Now they were asking him to go back in, not to steal from a room, but to retrieve a man. They inserted at night again. A Lysander dropped them 5 miles west of Offenburg, wheels barely skimming a frozen patch of farmland. Greaves and Wren moved quickly, two figures in black slipping beneath the woods with frost crackling underfoot. Their destination was a monastery, or what had once been one, hidden among the hills. Intelligence suggested Rasmuller had used the old bell tower as a transmission relay. The path took them through forest that hadn't seen footsteps in weeks. The snow fell quietly, blanketing the world in a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like waiting. When they reached the monastery's edge, the bell tower stood dark. No lanterns, no movement, just a rusted cross and stone steps half buried in drifts. Inside they found a radio set, warm, recently used, and Rasmuller's body hanging from a rafter. Wren swore under his breath, "Gestapo." Greaves said nothing. He walked to the body, cut it down, and found a crumpled piece of paper stuffed into Rasmuller's coat lining. 4 characters. One word, Ulrich. Not a name, a location, Ulrichstein. Another relay station, another potential breach or trap. They reached it 2 nights later. In the wind and snow, they moved with little sleep, living on hard biscuit and melted snow, following old logging trails until they found a signal tower disguised as a forestry office. The fence around it was thin, the windows dark. Wren whispered, "If this is a trap." Greaves raised a hand. "It is. That's why we're going in anyway." They breached it in silence. The wire cutters barely made a sound. Inside, they found a single technician, not Gestapo, not armed, just a young man with headphones on and a blank Morse sheet rolling under his pen. Greaves moved first. "Gun drawn, don't speak." The man froze. Wren yanked the headphone cable out and opened the side panel of the relay set. His eyes widened. "Christ," he muttered, "this isn't German." Inside the device was British wiring, British solder, British frequency calibration. They weren't intercepting the Germans. They were intercepting Bletchley. Back in London, Turing slammed the report down. "They've built reverse taps," he said through gritted teeth. "They're watching our routing traffic and mirroring cipher lag." It wasn't perfect. The Germans couldn't read everything, not yet, but they could observe, and observation meant prediction. The Atlantic convoys had begun to suffer again. 3 ships lost in a single week. Not catastrophic, but worrying. Turing looked across the table at Commander Godfrey. "If they crack our naval Enigma mirror, they'll turn the tide again." Godfrey nodded, "Then stop them." Bletchley issued what would later be called Directive 13, a classified operation to reorient Allied encryption sequences using disinformation. They fed the German network intentionally incorrect data, shadow convoys, fake frequencies, ghost ships. And then they watched. The Germans bit hard. 3 U-boat groups were deployed in February to intercept convoys that didn't exist. One commander reported visual contact with an Allied freighter that, on later review, was never real. Panic swept Berlin's Cipher Command. Dönitz suspected sabotage. Cipher teams were rotated. Enigma pads were pulped. But it didn't matter. The Allies were already 2 steps ahead. Operation Wintertide had not just stolen an edge. It had changed the way the war was fought. The Germans were no longer confident. They were chasing ghosts in water too wide to control. And behind every maneuver, every intercept, every saved convoy, was a man with no name in a file and no grave marked on a map. Greaves returned from Ulrichstein without speaking. He walked into the same Kent safe house and handed over a pouch. Inside it, the mirrored cipher disk, the final piece confirming Germany's observation program. Godfrey opened it and nodded once. "You've bought us another 6 months." Greaves said, "I'm done." Godfrey looked at him long and hard. "No, you're not. You're just getting started." The summer of 1943 crept into Europe on tired legs. Bomb craters filled with rain, Roads buckled under the weight of tanks, and cities once untouched now shook nightly from the weight of Allied steel. In London, the blackouts continued. In Berlin, the lights dimmed voluntarily. No one wanted to be seen. Inside Bletchley Park, HUD-8 never slept. Rows of codebreakers hunched over intercepted traffic, their hands raw from friction and ink. Turing barely left his office. His sleeves were stained with chalk and coffee, his collar askew, his gaze locked on cipher strings that curled across the pages like serpents. Naval Enigma had held, but barely. German cipher protocols were becoming less predictable. They no longer rotated rotor sequences according to fixed schedules. Plugboard wiring was being altered more frequently, almost at random. It was like watching a chess opponent flip the board mid-match, then smile. And then the losses resumed. In early July, convoy ONS 143 disappeared into fog west of Iceland. 31 merchant ships, all but 9 destroyed. Survivors reported coordinated submarine strikes coming from angles their escorts couldn't predict. U-boats weren't hunting blindly anymore. They were waiting. Something was listening again. Greaves was pulled from retirement that same week. He didn't protest. He hadn't unpacked. They brought him to Whitehall this time. The real war was no longer fought in bunkers or forests. It was fought in paper corridors and encrypted whispers. A major from the Special Liaison Unit handed him a telegram with no signature, only a phrase. Capitulum X, in glass compromised. Capitulum X, the 10th relay outpost, part of Britain's internal cipher masking net. Greaves had helped install the station near Rents in 1942. It was meant to catch German pattern adaptation before it reached the Atlantic theater. If it had been breached, every signal routed through British mirror networks might be visible again. Greaves said only 3 words, "Where's the breach?" The major answered France, but not Rents, Marseille. That wasn't possible. Marseille had been bombed into oblivion. There were no relay stations there. Unless one had been rebuilt without telling London. In occupied France, the remnants of Vichy authority shuffled through offices wearing German uniforms. But in the back alleys of Marseille, where bricks still smoked from Allied raids, someone had begun transmitting again shortwave pulses, non-standard burst formats, low bandwidth, high frequency. British, but not from a known tower, not from any MI6 transmitter. The signal came twice a day, always at 4:17, always at 22:12. It was the same format used by British deception branches to seed false information to double agents inside Spain. But this signal wasn't going to Spain. It was going to Königsberg, to the Abwehr. Wren had been sent in first. Greaves wasn't told. He learned it the hard way when Wren's code word didn't arrive on schedule. 2 days late, a battered transmission came in over secure line from Gibraltar. Cicada is compromised. 1 survivor, extraction impossible. Greaves didn't ask who survived. He only asked when he was going. He arrived in Marseille under the name Howard Blake, carrying French identification papers forged so well even the Germans had trouble verifying them. He spoke French passably, enough to argue about tobacco prices, and ask for directions with convincing exhaustion. The signal source was traced to a post office substation, an innocuous little structure flanked by rubble and laundry lines, built over what had once been a Roman foundation. They didn't expect it to be guarded, but it was. Greaves watched from a flat across the street. He counted 4 men, not Wehrmacht, not SS. Civilian suits, clean shoes, no insignia, but they were armed, and they rotated shifts with military punctuality, which meant only one thing: German counterintelligence. The building wasn't transmitting Allied lies. It was rebroadcasting Allied truths. Captured British routing information, re-encrypted and fed into German listening posts as confirmation. This wasn't just a leak. It was a mirror turned inside out. At 300, Greaves crossed the alley, scaled the drainpipe, and entered through the shattered second-floor window. The substation was hollowed out, retrofitted with a British Mark IV burst transmitter stolen from a downed aircraft. He recognized it instantly. Taped to the side of the transmitter was a letterhead from the Admiralty's Shadow Office. A forgery, but near perfect. The Germans hadn't stolen the device. They'd copied it. And they were using it to send feedback into British deception circuits, allowing the abwehr to calibrate false routes from within. Every British convoy shielded by misdirection was being fed back into the enemy's intelligence cycle. They had built a loop, a machine for untangling lies by echoing them back until they contradicted themselves. The transmitter was transmitting doubt. Greaves didn't destroy it. That would be obvious. Instead, he rewired the frequency crystal, reversed the burst sync, and redirected the delay oscillator. The next message the Germans received would look correct. But it would be 3 days old. And by then, the real convoy would be halfway across the Atlantic. Back in London, the loop broke. Bletchley watched as U-boat clusters moved like dogs chasing their tails. Convoys slipped through. Radar contacts vanished. For 1 week, no ships were lost. Godfrey summoned Greaves to Whitehall, poured him a glass of whiskey, and said, "You were wrong, you know." Greaves didn't answer. "You thought the war would be won by the man with the loudest rifle, but it'll be won by the man who listens longest without blinking." Greaves sipped his drink. Then Godfrey leaned closer and added, "And you've just blinked 1 time less than the rest." The code word was Harbourmouth. It arrived in a sealed envelope at 3:14 a.m. delivered to the safe house in Kent under heavy rain. Greaves read it once, burned the envelope in the ashtray, and told the courier nothing more than "Tell them I'll go." He already knew where. It was Calais. Or rather, it looked like Calais. From early 1944 onward, the entire British deception apparatus had turned its focus toward a singular goal, convincing the Germans that when the Allies came, they would strike not at Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais. The greatest amphibious force in history was forming in silence across southern England. But the only way it could cross the Channel safely was if the Germans were facing the wrong direction when it did. They needed to sell a lie that would hold even after the landings began. The core of the plan was called Operation Fortitude. It involved fake divisions, inflatable tanks, dummy radio chatter, and a phantom army supposedly led by General Patton. But all of it, every whisper, every transmission, every prop tent, only worked if one final piece fell into place. They needed to convince the Germans that their own spies were confirming Calais as the real target. And that meant one of those spies, an actual abwehr agent, had to be turned. Quietly, permanently, no arrests, no interrogations. They had to make him a liar who didn't know he was lying. Greaves had done things like this before, but never with so much riding on a single conversation. The agent's code name was Baumritter. Real name, Erwin Lerwenhaupt. German-born, fluent English, embedded in London since 1942 under the cover of a trade attaché. MI5 had tracked him for months but hadn't arrested him. Not yet. They needed him active for just long enough. Greaves was inserted not to apprehend, but to intercept. The plan was simple. Intercept Baumritter en route to one of his dead drops near Faversham. Replace his packet with one MI5 had rewritten to include falsified Allied plans pointing directly at Calais. But the Germans were watching too. They were nervous. Their own reports conflicted. Some suggested large-scale movement near Portsmouth and Southampton, others closer to Dover. And now Baumritter had gone to ground. He'd missed his last drop, changed his routes, gone silent. Greaves knew what that meant. Someone had tipped him off. The lie was at risk. It was nearly midnight when Greaves found him. The agent was standing alone in the ruins of an old grain store near the Thames, the river black and slow behind him. He didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just said, "You're not MI5. Greaves didn't answer. Baumritter laughed bitterly. "I know who you are. They told me MI5 doesn't speak French in a Silesian accent, so why are you here?" Greaves stepped closer. No gun, just rain and tension. "You have one chance to go home," he said, "but only if you help us lie." Baumritter stared at him, rain dripping off his chin. "You think I would betray my country?" "No," Greaves said. "I think you already did. You just haven't realized for whom yet." Then he handed the man a single page. It was written in German, stamped with the eagle seal of the WW2, a forgery so perfect even Berlin would believe it had been sent from their own office. It ordered Baumritter to report false intelligence as part of a strategic deception to test Allied counterintelligence protocols. It was a lie within a lie, a snake eating its tail. And Baumritter believed it. He made his drop 3 nights later. The report he transmitted included detailed observations of phantom units in Kent, falsified chatter about landing vessels moving toward Calais, and intercepted proof of logistical buildup near Dover. Berlin bought it. Hook, line, and Panzer Division. In the final weeks before D-Day, Hitler ordered his 15th Army to remain in Calais, even after the first Allied boots hit Normandy. For 7 full weeks, elite German units waited for a main invasion that never came. The beaches bled red, but the lie held. Turing never mentioned fortitude in his papers. Greaves was never listed among the contributors to Ultra, but the victory owed as much to wires and whispers as it did to Sherman tanks or Spitfire wings. The secret war hadn't just supported the invasion. It had created the conditions for it to happen at all. And it had begun with a stolen rotor, in a cold room off the coast of Holland, where 5 men walked through surf in silence to open the first lock. The beaches of Normandy had long since been cleared by the time the last message arrived. It was mid-September 1944. Allied divisions were already pushing toward Belgium. Paris had fallen. The Vichy government had collapsed. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 5 squadrons left in the west, but inside Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, the pressure hadn't lifted. If anything, the urgency had become sharper, more surgical. One error, one missed pattern, and what had been won by deception could still be lost by overconfidence. Turing looked down at the decrypt on his desk. It was brief, only 4 words in the original German. Operation Nordlicht terminated, orders rescinded. No explanation, no cipher confusion, it was an intentional end. Operation Nordlicht was a contingency, a last-ditch plan from the German Naval Command to regroup a final U-boat offensive, to commit every remaining submarine into a coordinated ambush in the North Atlantic, one that could choke Allied logistics and delay reinforcement to the European mainland. But it had never launched, because they'd believed the Allies were watching their mirror too closely, because someone had made them see ghosts that weren't there. Because the machine had been turned against its master. Greaves had read the same message, but not at Bletchley. He was on the edge of a pier in Le Havre, seated beside a stack of crated rations and a duffel bag that hadn't been opened in months. He held the paper loosely between his fingers, the ink already beginning to bleed from seawater in the air. He'd expected to feel something. Victory, closure, vindication. But all he felt was the strange quiet of a war that hadn't quite ended, but no longer needed him to finish it. He had spent 3 years in the silence between signals, hunting for patterns, disrupting wires, feeding lies to men he'd never meet. The men who crossed beaches and froze in hedgerows never saw what he did. They never heard the soft click of an intercepted rotor or the mechanical churn of the bomb spitting out a match. but they had lived because of it. For Greaves, that was enough. He folded the message once, tucked it into the lining of his coat, and walked away from the sea. At Bletchley, the last German naval codebooks were decrypted by the end of October. The Kriegsmarine's communication lines fell silent one by one, not with a scream, but with a steady exhale, as if even the enemy knew there was no longer any point. Turing returned to theoretical work. The bomb was dismantled, replaced by newer machines with names no one outside the chain of command would ever learn. Men burned documents in steel drums behind the huts, while others boxed up typewriters and erased chalkboards for the last time. Hut 8 became just another structure, with peeling paint and locked doors. But its memory would remain in every convoy that crossed safely, in every ship that made it to the other side, in every encrypted whisper that died before it could kill. And in the ashes of that war, a new kind of silence settled, not the fearful quiet of being hunted, but the kind that follows a storm when the ground is still wet and the sky, somehow, is whole again. There was no ceremony for Greaves. No medal. No parade. He returned to a cottage on the edge of Sussex, near a disused telegraph tower whose wires had long since rotted away. Some said he took up carpentry. Others said he walked the cliffs most mornings, watching the horizon like he expected something to come back. But the truth was simpler. The man who helped blind the German war machine had nothing left to see. He had done his job. And the world had turned. Across Europe, history was rewritten in cities, not forests, in treaties, not transmissions. But in the margins of those histories, between the names of generals and battles, there is a quiet trail, a path through static and silence, marked not by blood or flame, but by precision, by patience, by ghosts who moved through the dark not to take lives, but to keep them from being lost. The secret British mission that changed the course of WWII never made the headlines. It never raised a flag. It never fired a shot. But it turned the deadliest enemy into a listener chasing echoes. And it won not by shouting louder, but by whispering better.